in. We can get going, but we can certainly get started. So I am honored to present you both. So Jay Stein has served as a rabbi of Greenberg for now going on his 8th year. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. I was not ordained, I got my master's there in '93. And he serves on an array of different committees. Are you still serving in Jewish law?
No.
But he serves in Jewish law, and he's also written many different articles as well, and a book,
a novel
that came out not too long ago.
2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What's the name of it?
It's called Found in Thought.
You can find it on Amazon.
Found in Thought. It's a novel.
Yeah, okay.
It's not worth reading.
In other words, it means go out and buy it.
Don't waste your time. It does make very nice kindling, though.
So in other words, go out and buy it right away, like after, but not right the second after he's done. After they're done something. Hi, welcome. Hi. So Reverend Gareth Evans serves as the 14th rector of the St. Barnabas Church, ordained in '96, and you've served over 25 years at the parish, serving the Church of England at Massachusetts and New York, and he holds a degree from Oxford and Harvard. So I want to welcome you both.
I haven't written a book though.
Yeah.
So you got that. You got that over me.
As I do.
Got that over me.
Yeah.
So thank you both for having this conversation. There has been a lot of excitement. So I'm going to leave it to you, and I will be in the back of the room for anybody who needs me for anything.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So,
And where are the viewers at home? Whereabouts? Do we have folks tuning in on Zoom right now?
we have one on Zoom right now.
Welcome one on Zoom. Well,
It's Larry Kunstadt.
oh, there he is. Hi, Larry.
So we're gonna we're gonna jump right in. Let me just start by saying, so we in the Jewish tradition, let's not show who's Jewish and not Jewish. We can just tell. So in the Jewish tradition, every week there is a scriptural selection. In the Christian church, it's called the encyclical, and we follow a certain cycle as well. And this week's Torah portion, Parshat Vayishlach, has the very famous story of Rachel stealing her father's idol trinket when she is whisked away in the middle of the night. Much early on in the Abraham narrative, Abraham smashes his father's idols. And what's interesting to me about both of those scenarios, and I'm in discussion with a member of my congregation now about that, is the fact that both wanted to do something to a loved one, and they knew that doing it to their idol was something that would have a lasting impact. For Abraham, it was a destructive act. For Rachel, she stole this because she wanted her father to come after her, right? In order to have their goodbye. Both are about what is sacred to somebody else and how do we treat that. And the idea that Gareth and I can sit together, talk about a common text and where our traditions go with it, speaks to the fact that we know how sacred this is to both of us, and how gently we feel we need to be and respectful of what another tradition does with it. Okay. And so I think that's important. The truth of the matter is, for me, any act of study is really just an act of coming to know somebody else. Gareth and I have been working alongside now for quite a few years, and we know each other well. This was born of the fact that we were both working out here at the same time.
Flex.
Yeah.
No, I said flex.
Yeah,
Oh, I like to see that. You just went like that. I felt it. He went,
Okay, so Gareth works out and I just walk around talking to people.
he doesn't. He's on the treadmill a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. For those of you who are a member of the congregation, it's good to know, isn't it, that your clergy are looking after themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important.
I wish I hadn't mentioned that I work out. Just, they don't know I take any time off of the office.
Oh, they don't? They think you're there 24/7?
Yeah, they think I'm
Yeah,
my
yeah.
office. Yeah, so before 9, yes, well, before 4. I'm usually here 4 to 5 in the morning. Anyway, so this opportunity for us to study together is really an act of building fellowship, camaraderie, and understanding each other. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to simply present the biblical text. That's our foundational text. Let me save one for each of us. I always, people in my congregation know that I do this all the time, right? I try not to make enough copies so that I feel like, oh my God, the number of people that came were so overwhelming. I didn't make enough copies. But I think I didn't do that this time. In any case, the biblical text that we're going to focus on today for the next little bit is the story of Abraham receiving these 3 messengers. The biblical text is difficult in its original to understand how we would, or what we would call these messengers. Were they people? Were they semi-divine, angelic-like creatures? Were they completely divine creatures? There's no question in the Torah, what we refer to as the Hebrew Bible, that there is much confusion about divine-like characters that live alongside God. But that would be a whole other can of worms to open up. So I just want to show you the biblical text. I've given it to you both in the Hebrew and the English. So I only bring to you the pre-text to this, just so that you can see the context of what's going on. So God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, this is before she gets her name changed from Sarai to Sarah. You shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be called Sarah. I will bless her. Indeed, I will give her a son I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of people shall issue from her. Abraham threw himself on his face and he laughed. I added he just for emphasis, because what we're going to see later is Sarah laughs. What's really interesting is they named their son Isaac Laughter, right? Which should theoretically be a thorn in each of their sides, right? Because each one is laughing at the other. But let's just say it's nice that they have greater laughter in their house, okay? Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed. And he said to himself, can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear a child at 90? Right? Let's not at all go into the discussion of is it possible, not possible? Did they count ages the same way they count ages today? You know, everybody in the Bible gets to be hundreds of years old, right? Let's not do that. Now, here's the story. God appeared, you can see it's in Hebrew, God appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 figures standing near him. 3 figures. Again, if you were to look in the Hebrew text, it says V'nei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav. Right, there were 3 people. Right, the English fudges it here. Right, it says that 3 individuals. Or 3 figures were standing near him. Perceiving this, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, my lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought to you, bathe your feet, and recline yourselves, then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way. They said, quick, 3 seahs of your choice flour, knead, and cake. Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, gave it to the servant boy who hastened to prepare it. He took curds of milk and the calf that had been prepared and set before him, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And they replied, and he replied, "They're in the tent." Then one said, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah having stopped having her periods, and Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "Now that I have lost the ability, am I to have the enjoyment with my husband who's so old?" I have to emphasize, my husband who is so old, right? Then God said to Abraham, now note, it's not the messengers, it's not these individuals, it's not these figures, but God says to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Shall I in truth bear a son as old as I am?'" This is obviously what we refer to as a harmless lie. I just as a side, I try never to refer to harmless lies as white lies. And the reason for that is I think it's a bigoted statement. Okay? Everything in our culture that is white is good, right? White lies are supposedly okay. Everything in our society which is black is considered bad. So angel's food cake is what color? White. Devil's food cake is black, right? So we should try our very best because language is incredibly important to stay away from that. Right? Black Friday, right? But Black Friday is in comparison to Giving Tuesday, right? Giving Tuesday is the good action. Black Friday is considered a self-absorbed materialistic approach to living, right? So do you want to go down this road with me? I'm happy to.
Let's not.
Okay, let's go back to the text. All right. Then God said to Abraham, "Is anything too wondrous for God? I will return to the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son." She lied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was frightened. Came the reply, "You did laugh." The agents set out from there and looked down towards Sodom, Abraham walking with them to see them off, right? That's the biblical text, right? Chapter 17 has God announcing to Abraham that he's going to have a child through Sarah. Then we have this entire story with 3 messengers announcing again to Abraham that he's going to have a child. And that is who comes to be known to us as Isaac. All right?
Brilliant. Thanks, Jay.
Just in
Yes, go ahead.
English culture, when they say brilliant, they don't mean brilliant.
Well, there's a certain luminosity, isn't there, to Jay's ministry. So in that sense, he's illuminated the text, certainly illuminated the text for me this morning. And of course, being a Christian minister, to hear the Hebrew is like, that's manna from heaven right there, just for that to go in through my ears, even though I hear it and I can't interpret it. It's almost like all of a sudden you're getting closer to the source, right? Getting closer to the source. From a Christian perspective, this particular little passage in Genesis 18 has captured the collective imagination for centuries. It's become more than just an incidental reaffirmation of what has already been said. It becomes its own unique spiritual moment in the unfolding of God's purposes through Abraham and Sarah. And so it opens up a whole world of meaning for Christians that we're going to explore. By the 15th century, this story had become so significant that Rublev, who was an absolutely amazing icon painter, captured this scene in this particular way. You see the three angels, semi-divine figures, who become, for the Christian imagination, the very representation of God. So it's fascinating to me, Jay, that in the Hebrew, they're described as people. By the time that gets translated into the English, it becomes very ambiguous as to what degree were they simply human, and to what degree were they angels, divine messengers of God, to reaffirm what has already been said and gifted to her. And by the 15th century, they represent, in Christian terms, an icon of the Holy Trinity. And so what we do see is that from these foundational texts, a whole world of meaning emerged as Christianity began to take on its own interpretive, creative, and sort of imaginative way of reinterpreting this text. So you might argue that when we hear what is written in the Hebrew, we get it's a very human story. It is a very human story that's fraught with all kinds of questions and dangers around childbirth. And, how will this little tribe of people lay claim to God's blessing for them through a couple?
Right. What's really interesting is the childbirth here is not the same miraculous childbirth that we talk about all the time, right? Like we say, if you ever saw a child being born, you would know it was miraculous. Like, how many things have to go right in order for a child to be conceived and then born, right? The millions and whatever things that have to happen in order for it to occur. So, but this is more than miraculous in the regular birth sense, right? This is miraculous in the sense that Sarah and Abraham are well beyond years of being able to conceive, right? Which gives birth to, no pun intended, to the miraculous nature of this experience of what's going on. So there's no question that for both of us, this moment is miraculous. That is not within the normal, natural cycle, right?
Jay, could you say a little bit more about that? Because from a Christian perspective, we talk about God's salvation, or to put it a little bit more technically, God's salvific hand in history. Would this be perceived as a supernatural interruption in the flow of history from your perspective, or is it actually is God working through them to sort of in the historical moment? Is this a miracle, a supernatural miracle opening up here, or is it simply the unfolding of a historical event? What's your sense of that?
So obviously there's way more in that question than I could answer right now, right? So first I would say this. From my perspective, miracles have a very short shelf life. What I mean by that is something members of my congregation hear all the time, and that is when a miracle occurs in the Bible or in our own personal lives, it has an immediate, profound impact that we usually forget by the next day. Really, it's an amazing thing. There are very few events in our lives in which we can say that was a singular moment that changed the trajectory of my belief system and how I behave. Because we tend to say, oh, that was a great experience, but move on. When is my next miracle coming? Right? So that's why I try and stay away from miracles in general. Second thing is I would say that the entire Bible is based on what is referred to in both of our traditions as liberation theology, right? This idea that God continues to come and help those who need assistance. Mm-hmm. That was a very shorthand on liberation theology.
That's great. Because what happens to this text in the Christian tradition is it ceases to be a static moment or a static snapshot And it becomes this long exposure
Yeah.
of God's ongoing engagement with our
Exactly.
humanity.
Right.
So I love the way you put that, Jay, in terms of like, let's not just think of the miracle as some sort of little moment that is instantly forgotten, because this actually sets up a whole sort of chain of events, doesn't it, and trajectory where people are established in a land.
Right. What I find fascinating about it is, so speak for a second about the word became flesh.
Oh, gosh.
The
word
word
became flesh. So in the beginning of John's gospel, which is, we don't need to get too technical here, but it begins with a hymn. It begins with a beautiful, beautiful hymn of praise. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And, we have this amazing sort of unfolding of that song until it says, and that the Word became flesh. Now, what is the Word?
Good.
What is the Word? The Word, from the Christian perspective that's been influenced by Greek philosophical thought, is that it is the divine intelligence, the knowledge, are you familiar with the word nous, using your nous? So it's a very old English word, which means using the gray matter, using what you've got up here. And so the Word, the pre-existent Word, is, if you like, the very knowledge and intelligence of God taking on human form, and the Word became flesh. So this notion of the Word.
Just pause you for 1 second.
Yeah.
For Jews, the Word is the Torah. That's, for Jews, the Hebrew Bible is the way we access the will of God. Right? So we stop at the Word.
Yes, and I appreciate that, because from a Christian perspective, we do the heavy lift around that Word becoming embodied in human flesh, and I would say this, that that's where the Christians have to do their work. That's where the Christians have to pick up the baton and walk the talk and do what they say the implications of the Word becoming flesh is all about. But of course, we can't do our work without the Torah, because Jesus knew the Torah. So Jesus's whole life was shaped by his relationship to the Torah. But from a Christian perspective, once we make that leap of the imagination and we say that, the very intelligence of God becomes a human being, then that changes the dynamic of how the Word is revealed and unfolded. But when we think about Abraham and Sarah, this also changes the dynamic. It's a game changer.
Yeah.
But I would say this, and I'll use this term. We must be prepared to bring our religious imaginations to the text and not just our doctrines. Because if this is about doctrinal difference, then the conversation really does stop hard once we make a claim to the Word becoming flesh. You could say, well, that's the end of the conversation. Exactly. Because it shifts from a conversation about being intrigued about this text to a doctrinal or creed it becomes about the creeds, it becomes about doctrines, it becomes about dogma. And what I would say is, I really welcome Jay accompanying me as far as the tomb, if he wants to. We can even gaze up at the cross. But when we get to the tomb, that really is my work, not his. And I wouldn't expect him to have to do any of that work. It's over, it's up to us at that point, isn't it?
So do the next two steps here with this text. So the text here for the Hebrew Bible, this is a story about Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. And potentially three messengers, three godlike figures, three angels, whatever.
Right.
For you, it becomes the foundation for what?
worship. It becomes a foundation for entering into that space within ourselves where we have reverence for God. And I say that because the one thing that I love about Abraham in this story is that he prostrates himself before them. He bows down to the ground. And one way in which we signify to ourselves and others that we're in a state of worship is by what we do with our bodies. What we do with our bodies. And so for me, this is an indicator that although the text may say these were three people, he actually showed a deep reverence for them. And therein begins, for me, the invitation into sacred space, into developing a disposition towards the divine, which could be one of praise, reverence, one whereby we begin to worship with our body, minds, and souls before this great mystery that is God.
Great. And I would say that for us, we don't go that far with that, right? We don't introduce this story as a prayerful moment in our tradition. In our tradition, this is a moment where we teach about what we refer to as hachnasat orchim, welcoming of guests, right? This becomes the primary story for how we teach both from the youngest age to the oldest. When somebody, anybody comes to your door, this is what you're supposed to do. Yeah, Larry.
So is there any other translation of the original Hebrew word that you're saying is personal? That I know Hebrew words can be, translated in a number of different ways that might enable Christianity to look at those figures as something other than people.
Good. So just look, I don't know how I possibly could have anticipated your question, but look at the very last line on the English side of the page. Rashi, one of the great biblical commentaries, right? At the very bottom, it says, Nitzavim alav. Do you see where it is? Do you see where I'm at the very bottom? If you don't read Hebrew, I'm going to translate everything. Don't worry about it. Nitzavim alav is Rashi saying, I'm going to comment on these two words. They visited him, right? Lifanav aval lashon nikiyahu klapei hamlachim. You know the word for angels is melachim, right? So Rashi already when's Rashi? 14th century? Rashi already understands that everybody understands this text not as people, but as angels, right? So now to answer your question more directly, yes, there are loads of different translations. This happens to be what we refer to as a JPS translation. They originally did a translation in the 60s, then they revamped it in the 2000s, and this is a translation from there. But you could see any number of translations. Here's a good plug for what I always plug, and that is Sepharia.org. Sefaria.org. You can find any biblical text, and you can select one of any. I think there may be 7 or 8, maybe even 10 different translations on that website for this and any biblical text. So you're absolutely right. We already understand in our tradition, it's not just 3 people. It had to have been some sort of figure. And that's why the English says 3 figures, not 3 people.
The word malachim it has melech in it, right? King.
No, wrong. Sorry, let me take that back. I guess there are some letters that overlap, but malach is different than a melech. Malach is usually referred to as a messenger. In the Bible, that is the 5 books of Moses, not the prophets and not the writings, but melech is a king, malach is a messenger. There is an association between them because originally kings were anointed. and therefore became messengers of the Almighty, right? So that becomes an important part of the puzzle, but they are clearly different things. Rita?
Do you think something that you could comment on the concept of the three wise men and Mary giving birth?
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to prompt you on, then you went the whole
Well,
prayer thing.
Yes.
Giving birth.
Well, I think there's a sort of an allusion or a parallel, isn't there? And remember in this notion of the prostration, in the little nativity story, and there are two of them, one in Luke and one in Matthew. But in the Matthew version, we get the three magi, or the magicians, or the ancient astronomers, or as is in popular belief, the three kings approach the crib, and what do? They prostrate themselves. It says in the English text that they bowed down, but actually, I'll show you exactly what they did, and this is why coming to the gate is really helpful. What they did was this.
You've seen me do that on my holidays.
Oh, there you go. So that's what they actually did, and it's a gesture of deep humility. And so you don't see that if you're familiar with, whether you go down.
Do not lean back on your chair.
Thank you. Whether I appreciate that.
Years of being a teacher,
Yeah,
kids leaning back on their chairs, breaking their wrists.
exactly. So you go down North Broadway or South Broadway, you will see the nativity scenes. There's a large one outside the Church of the Immaculate Conception right now, and there's a large one outside.
Still out there?
They just put it out yesterday. And then there's a large one that will be installed, no doubt, outside is it Sacred Heart in Dobbs Ferry?
Mhm.
Do you see the kings prostrating themselves? You don't, do you? You see them often sort of in a gesture of deep reverence, a gesture of worshipful attention. But actually, the parallel there, of course, is that when you are before the miracle, or you are participating in the miracle, it does demand from you some sort of physical sign that you get it. And so the kings obviously are often knelt and they're presenting their gifts in that way. And then, of course, the parallel about giving birth. What happens in the Christian imagination, of course, is that Mary is no longer just the 14-year-old girl who has had a child out of wedlock, for whom Joseph, the father, agrees to divorce her secretly, and then is persuaded, because he's visited by an angel in a dream, to take her as his wife, rather than it just be a story of scandal. It becomes, in the Christian imagination, the moment through which Mary herself is divinized. And you probably have heard, may well be familiar with the term the Immaculate Conception. That refers to how she was conceived, not how Jesus was conceived. It's a reference to her divinity. So in the full-blown Christian imagination, she becomes the God-bearer, the Theotokos. She herself becomes a divine figure. And for those of us, for those of us who are devoted to female deity, if you like, Mary becomes a great source of comfort, because she herself becomes one through which she becomes a source of an intercessory prayer. You can pray through Mary to God, if that is your particular spiritual tradition.
What's wild about that is when we refer to God in the feminine form, the Shekhinah, that's our feminine name for God. That's also the same sense of mercy and compassion, right? I don't know if you know the custom that when you say a prayer for someone who is ill, you say it with their name and their mother's name. The idea that the feminine aspect of the divine is more compassionate than, let's say, the male on that binary, is not foreign to Judaism,
Mm.
right? In fact, for us, did you ever hear the word Rahmanis? What does Rahmanis mean? Compassion, mercy. It comes from the Hebrew word rechem, which means womb. Rahmanis and womb, according to our tradition, is the source of compassion and mercy.
I have a question about translation. You were
Sure.
talking about the Hebrew translation. I was wondering about the Latin translations. The original Latin being then translated to English. Is there a similar kind of distortions or changes?
Well, you know, the transmission of the text from one language to another is truly a trip and can be a source of tripping over. The translators are not neutral. They always bring their political biases, their economic biases, their biases for language that it is exclusively male versus language for God that is gender neutral, and so on and so forth. So from I bow before Jay's deep wisdom on this, but I will say simply this, that we go from the Hebrew to the Greek, and from the Greek into the Latin, and from the Latin into the English. We're talking at least 5 different steps right there historically over time before you get into the myriad of translations in the English. So if you go back to, what the modern scholars do is they don't go to the Vulgate, the Latin translation. They go back to the Hebrew, obviously for the Hebrew Bible, and the Greek for the New Testament. So because the Latin doesn't always, although it translates beautifully into English, sometimes the true meaning is lost as a result. So it's always the Enlightenment call, of course, was back to the sources. Get back to the source, the sources of philosophical knowledge, the source texts.
So the change in culture also brings on different translations.
It really does.
And the agenda of the translator.
Yeah, it's
Right.
huge.
Well, even within English translations, you'll find a variety of different agenda. If, for example, you came to my synagogue, our synagogue, and saw we use something called the Eitz Chaim Chumash, right, which is the JPS translation. The translation there would be probably very different than what you might find in an Orthodox congregation that might use the stone Chumash, the art scroll Chumash. Just because everybody has an agenda. We always say that the first commentary on a text is its translation.
I want to go back to the bowing down. I was taught that Jews don't bow to anybody except God. Am I wrong? Because you were saying that Abraham would be bowing to any guest.
So it's very interesting, right? Like you and I were talking about this beforehand, how much weight we place on the story, and then therefore what we do with each and every action in the story. I had never heard the take on the story of this being a story about worship, prayer. And therefore, I never, I have to go back and look at the text and see where we get this sense of bowing. We do have a sense in Judaism of nodding to somebody. I call it the yid nod. I call it a yid nod because let's say, for example, I'm at not Shea Stadium, City Field, right? I'm wearing my kippah, right? I'm wearing my yarmulke, and I see another guy walk by who's wearing a yarmulke. Do you know what we'll do? Right? It's like a secret handshake, right? So nodding and full prostration are completely different things, right? Acknowledging somebody by bowing your head originally was done in a combative society. It was a way of saying, I trust you not to whack me over the head, right? That's why in, for example, Eastern religions, there's a lot of this bowing that goes on. It's a way of saying, I trust you're not going to hit me. Western society said shake hands. You know why? Because they wanted to show I have no weapon in my hand, right? So bowing originally had this sense of acknowledgement and a sense of trust, right? Which is a part, it's only a piece of what prayer is.
True. And I know that, Jay, from the way you sort of exegeted the text initially for us, that this is essentially an ethical imperative to do this for your neighbor, to do this for the stranger and the visitor. And of course, I sort of responded, well, this is an occasion for us to open up our imaginations and to reconceive our relationship with God. Well, it's the flip side of the same coin, because if you approach the text as an example of divine hospitality, then it has huge ethical implications.
Yeah, wasn't there there was a musical artist who once sang a song, "What if God were one of us?"
Oh yeah, yes, and
right?
it was sort
what
of,
if God were one of us, like
just on the sitting on the bus, like one of us,
right? How would we treat each other differently if we actually acknowledged the divine in each other? Right? That's that was my interpretation.
No, that's absolutely right.
Right. So, you know, that ancient rabbinic story is there's a town that's sniping at each other. Everybody doesn't get along. They can't stand each other. They go to the rabbi. What are we going to do? The rabbi says, I'll take it and advise, and comes back a day later and says, I spoke to God. God told me that one of the people in this town is the Messiah. Next thing you knew, everybody's treating everybody nicely because they don't know who's the Messiah. Right. So the idea that this gets expanded is a very easy jump. Like it's not even a jump. It's just a little step.
Right. And you can go straight from the word of God, the Torah, to that ethical impulse.
Exactly.
You can also take this, reinterpret it as a moment of iconography, of worshipful response. But the worshipful response has implications. And so what? And so what?
There you go. That's what I think both of us are at, where we overlap a lot on this, is the question of so what, right? So for the rabbinic tradition, we take away from this story 4 basic lessons, right? One is visiting the sick. Abraham had just circumcised himself, right? And Ishmael in the preceding chapter had just done it. So he's sitting outside his tent recuperating, right? And he's visited by these 3 figures. So the rabbis say, oh, that's an example of the imperative to visit the sick. Abraham's response immediately is to welcome them with open arms. The rabbis say, we should learn from that, welcoming guests. The next part that comes up for the rabbis is he's serving meat and milk at the same meal. How is it possible, since we know Abraham, who lived in biblical times, but knew all of rabbinic literature, right? They say, no, he served the milk first, and that's why you don't have as long a wait between eating milk products and you have eating meat products. If it had been the other way around, it would have been much more problematic. And then finally, the rabbis learned the message of harmless or beneficial lies, in which you're hurting somebody, but you're really trying to protect somebody, right? And so for us, we walk away with 3 or 4 things we can do based on the story. And what's interesting is not once does worship come into it.
Right, absolutely, because it shows us again the power of interpretation, doesn't it? The power of seeing something in a text and then developing a whole thought world out of it. Yeah.
Pastor Ben, are you saying that this story was the inspiration for the Holy Trinity, and that perhaps the birth of Isaac, the miraculousness of the birth of Isaac, is what inspired the miraculousness of the birth of Jesus?
Well, gosh, that's a very good question. So the development of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, you can't get there from here, really. You have to go via a whole development of what would be, in effect, understanding what is divine and understanding what is human, and what the Jesus figure does. When the word becomes flesh, then that has to be worked out over many, many centuries. So if this is the word made flesh, what is the relationship between the word made flesh and the uncreated word that was in the beginning? What is the relationship between the uncreated word and Ruach, the spirit that moves over the deep from the very first opening lines of Genesis? This spirit that that shows up in a way in the wisdom traditions as the female divine figure of God, that then gets reworked in the New Testament through Jesus saying, in John's gospel, I will send you an advocate, the one who will come after me, the Holy Spirit. So you have these strands of tradition that then have to be worked up into a thoroughgoing doctrine of the Trinity. And what we have in this icon, this 15th century icon by Rublev, is a way of talking about the Trinity by drawing upon this text and saying that from left to right, this figure, it represents God the Father, who has passed the cup to this figure in the middle, who is God the Son, presiding at the table, and this figure on the left, who is God the Holy Spirit, creating a kind of a symbol of unity around the cup, which immediately becomes for Christians a representation to us of Holy Eucharist. It becomes both a reinterpretation of the story in Trinitarian terms, and also a deep affirmation that divine hospitality is absolutely at the core of a way of understanding reality, the way of understanding reality that leads to the fourfold instruction around, tending to the sick, showing hospitality to the stranger, and so on. What was the third one?
Keeping kosher.
Keeping kosher,
laws
and then the ethical issues around truth telling that we all deal with.
I'll give you a literary answer to your question, not a theological answer to your question. That is, we have themes, motifs that follow straight through the entirety of biblical literature, be it Hebrew, Bible, New Testament, Gospels, right? We have themes that follow themselves through, right? We have themes of the role of water, for example, in the birth of the world, the birth of the Jewish people as they leave, Egypt and the parting of the sea, the birth of the nation of Israel as they cross the Jordan, right? So we have themes that run throughout. I would suggest that a theme of angels runs throughout. I personally think that every moment in the Hebrew Bible, when an angel appears, it's a moment of personal, individual conflict in which a person is struggling with something, and the Bible personifies that struggle in an angel, or personifies, anthropomorphizes the struggle into an individual. Abraham, for example, is going to sacrifice his son. What stops him? an angel, right? Hagar, right, is banished, right? She sees her son Ishmael dying, and because she doesn't know what to do, right? She doesn't know how to save him, right? An angel appears, right? So you could do that with almost anything in the Hebrew Bible, and that is suggest that it is a thematic, it's a motif that follows itself through. So the motif of individuals announcing or coming to visit is a motif, I think, that you might follow through. The image of a sheep and shepherd gets followed through. The theme of sacrifice gets followed through, right? And you could do that with many motifs. There was a question back there, sorry.
Question for the Reverend. John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
The rabbi said that the Word was the Torah, the Jews, and you said that the Word represented the knowledge.
The divine knowledge.
Is it possible that John was actually referring to the Torah in that sentence and trying to integrate the Jewish tradition into the birth?
That's a very interesting question. To what degree was Greek philosophical thought from Alexandria influenced by Jewish thought? Now, the great Jewish philosopher in Alexandria was Philo, and he was at this amazing juncture between two civilizations. And I think of him as a good Jew in that I think he loved his mama. I think he understood, he knew the importance, really the importance and the sacred nature and the gift that women in the Jewish tradition bring simply through their willingness to bear the children. And so there is that sense in which, as this particular Alexandrian hymn opens up, there is within it this great sense of the great birthing of creation, the great birthing of God's intelligence infused into the divine creative process, the birthing of God into human form. And then you also have, and for Philo, I'm sure, and for his school of thought, absolute enchantment with this new technology that they were being exposed to through the Greeks. This new technology was a way of thinking. It was an ancient technological way of reinterpreting the world. And so, you have a fusion of the deep and a deep reverence for the Jewish tradition, and where it then meets and intersects and is reinterpreted through a Greek way of understanding the world. So you're absolutely correct to sense that in that opening prologue, as we call it, or opening hymn, you have the fusion of the world of the Torah and the world of Greek thought, which saw the mind of God as being this rational principle, a rational principle, which is a very distinct way of understanding God from, the Jewish conception of God, which Jay can speak to more thoroughly than I can, but the God who, takes on an anthropomorphic form in certain situations, is very distant in certain situations, a God who is constantly renewing promises and covenants and so on. A very active God who is intimately interested and concerned for the people of Israel.
We have just 5 minutes left, and I want to make one comment that I may have alluded to but didn't make clear, and that is, for us, this story, when I say us, I mean the Jewish faith, this story is not a big story. For us, this is an interruption in a larger narrative, right? For us, this is a story really about 3 messengers coming for 3 separate purposes. One of those was to let them know Isaac was going to be born, but the other two were to save the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Sodom and Gomorrah. The next chapter is about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And what we get there is something really spectacular, and that is where Abraham actually argues with God, right? About not destroying, right? And becoming a messenger in and of himself for saving life. There's much in this story that we enjoy. It was the reason why we ended up with this text is because we went back and forth on lots of different texts that Gareth was really interested in doing early Genesis stuff, like
Exploring the snake. I really wanted us to talk about the snake.
Yeah.
Because I like snakes and it seems like a fun thing to.
Yeah.
Could have
I wasn't interested.
He wasn't interested.
But we end up on this story because something really happens in the evolution of religion. I think in this story. Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are essentially born around the exact same time.
Born out of a crisis.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't going to even speak to the environment that created it. I was only going to speak to the fact that we both are born of the same biblical tradition. Christianity went one direction with it. Judaism, through the rabbinic eyes, went in a different direction. You should know there isn't a single Jew today that practices the Bible according to the way the Bible is written, right? We only practice Judaism according to the way the rabbis read the Bible, right? So when you said earlier, it's hard to get from this story to
the Trinity.
Trinity. I say the same thing about tefillin, phylacteries. The black leather boxes that we wear when we pray. You'd have a hard time getting from you should put them as a sign on your arm and wear them as frontlets between your eyes, as we read in Deuteronomy or in Numbers. You'd have a hard time getting from there to black leather boxes with leather straps that have inside parchment, and you wear it up here on your head, not down here on your head. And right, you have a hard time doing that. The rabbis do that heavy lifting for us. Right. But I just want to make the point that, when, for example, in the Middle East, they signed the Abraham Accords, that's a deeply theological statement, right? And those are accords born of a shared ancestry, a commonality. Just because one became Ishmael or Esau, and one became Jacob, right? Or Isaac, still recognizes we're born of the same father. Now, I don't want to load the language there on father, but I would say that there is something incredibly powerful about the fact that we share a tradition and we do our own thing with it. But the truth is, that's what everybody does with religion. Everybody, call it Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, call it Protestant, Anglican, call it, Catholic, right? Everybody picks and then does what they want with it.
And we see that even within the New Testament. So you could argue what we call the New Testament is really a response ultimately to the Hebrew Bible. And so even by the end of the first century in the New Testament, we see responses to this story very, very early on. So I've just pulled up what the first letter of Peter, which was written towards the end of the first century. And we find this in chapter 4. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to the other one. Be hospitable to the other one without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks, must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. It's like a little prayer. So you get the ethical meat of this text, then gets worked out in early Christian community as they take that ethic and say, well, how are we going to live out that ethic of hospitality, and to do so in community together? And so in the New Testament, which is infused, of course, with references to Jesus of Nazareth, who becomes the anointed one, the Christ, within those early Christian communities, these foundational texts were reworked and found new energy and life.
Should we do it again?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do it all over again.